The taste of iron arrived before the pain. It was a thick, copper-heavy syrup that coated my tongue and pooled in the back of my throat, warm and sickeningly sweet. I tried to swallow, but the liquid was an encroaching tide, rhythmic and relentless. Somewhere above me, the sky was hemorrhaging. The rain didn't fall, it descended in shards of frozen glass, needles of ice that shattered against my skin. I could feel the grit of the Manhattan pavement against my cheek, the wet, oily texture of an alleyway that had never seen sunlight. Every breath felt like a serrated blade being drawn through my lungs. I looked down, my vision blurring into a soft focus haze. My thrifted navy dress, the one I'd spent 3 weeks tailoring to look like a Dior original for this very gala, was dark. Not wet from the rain, but saturated with a blackness that steamed in the frigid October air. "You really should have seen the liability clause in our friendship, Elena," a voice whispered. It was Mia. Her voice was a crystalline soprano, perfectly pitched to sound like a consolation. She was crouching beside me, her vanilla-scented perfume clashing violently with the metallic tang of my own internal organs. She held a burner phone in one gloved hand, the screen glowing with a predatory blue light. In her other hand was the knife, a sleek, folding tactical blade. Julian's blade. My blood ran down the length of the steel, dripping onto her silver Jimmy Choo heels with a soft, rhythmic pat-pat-pat. I tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped was a wet, gargling rattle. My fingers twitched, scraping against the damp concrete, searching for a purchase I knew I wouldn't find. 10 feet away, the blacked-out windows of a Sterling real estate SUV hummed with a low, predatory vibration. Julian Sterling sat behind that glass. I could see the faint silhouette of his jawline, the sharp, aristocratic arrogance I had spent 4 years defending. I had been his scapegoat in 3 continents and 2 federal investigations. I had rewritten his botched code, doctored his betting ledgers, and stood as his human shield when the creditors came knocking. I thought I was his partner. To him, I was merely an underperforming line item on a balance sheet. "The police will be here in 6 minutes," Mia said, her thumb dancing across the phone screen with clinical precision. Julian already placed the call. A distressed bystander reported a scholarship girl caught in a drug deal gone wrong. "It's poetic, really. You were always so good at taking the fall. Why stop now?" She reached out, her fingers, manicured to a lethal point, gently tucking a strand of wet hair behind my ear. The touch was agonizingly tender. "Julian says thank you," she continued, her eyes reflecting the neon blue of the Sterling real estate sign flickering on the corner of 5th Avenue. "The asset stripping of your life is complete, Elena. Your patents? Julian's name is on the filing. Your college fund? I've already moved it through 3 offshore accounts in the Caymans. You aren't a person anymore. You're a closed file." She stood up, the silk of her gown whispering against her legs. Julian's SUV began to roll forward, its tires splashing through a puddle, spraying dirty water across my face. Mia reached into her clutch and pulled out a single $100 bill. She let it go. I watched it fall. It descended in slow motion, a green and white leaf caught in a vortex of wind and rain. It landed in the pool of red spreading from beneath my ribs, soaking up the warmth until it was heavy and sodden. "For the tip," Mia said, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the waiting car. "You were always a first-class servant." The car door thudded shut. A heavy, final sound. The sound of a vault closing. The SUV accelerated, its red taillights bleeding into the darkness like twin entry wounds. Silence settled over the alley, broken only by the frantic heartbeat of the city and the wet thrum of the rain. The cold began to move from my extremities toward my core, a slow, numbing erasure. I stared at the $100 bill. The ink was blurring. My life, my work, my soul, all of it had been liquidated for a piece of paper that was now rotting in my own blood. A clinical detachment settled in my chest, precise and freezing. My pulse remained perfectly flat even as my vision began to tunnel into a pinprick of white light. I didn't feel anger. Anger was too warm, too human. I felt a tectonic shift of purpose. If I was a closed file, I would become the ghost that haunted the system. The white light expanded, swallowing the alley, the rain, and the taste of iron. The pain vanished, replaced by a weightless, humming void. Then, a sound. Scritch. 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 The smell of old library oak and lemon-scented floor wax hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I gasped, my lungs expanding with a sharp, dry intake of air that tasted of dust and recycled oxygen. There was no iron. There was no vanilla. I was sitting in a high-backed chair, the green leather cool against my bare arms. My hands were resting on a polished mahogany table. They were clean. No blood. No scars. I looked down. I was wearing a cheap, navy blue school blazer with a gold crest. The St. Jude's Academy insignia. Elena? Are you even listening? I slowly lifted my head. My neck felt stiff, as if it were made of rusted clockwork. Sitting across from me was Mia Thornton. She looked younger. Her face lacked the sharp, expensive contours of the woman who had just watched me die. She was holding a stack of printed pages, her lower lip trembling in a practiced, manipulative pout that I once would have found endearing. "I'm serious, Elena," Mia whispered, leaning forward. The scent of her vanilla perfume was faint but unmistakable. "Julian is being a total monster. He went into the computer lab and accidentally wiped the local server where I saved my AP computer science project. It's due in 2 hours. If I don't submit it, I'll lose my 4.0, and my dad will literally kill me." She reached across the table, her fingers, unmanicured and soft, attempting to grab mine. I withdrew my hand before she could make contact, the movement so sudden and sharp that she blinked in surprise. "You have the backup on your encrypted drive, right?" Mia continued, her voice dropping into that breathless, best friend hush. "You're the only one who knows the system architecture well enough to bypass the firewall and re-upload it under my ID. Please, Elena. Just this once. I'll do anything." I stared at her. I watched the way her pupils dilated slightly as she lied. I watched the pulse at the base of her throat, quick, nervous, parasitic. In my previous life, I had stood up, spent the next 90 minutes hacking the school's admin portal, and handed her my own hard-coded algorithm, allowing her to take the credit while Julian Sterling watched from the back of the room with a smirk. That had been the first brick in the wall of my own tomb. A cold, tectonic stillness settled in my marrow. "The library maintains a secondary backup log, Mia," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, stable, ice-thin, and stripped of the warmth that had once been my fatal flaw. "If Julian wiped the server, the IT department can trace the MAC address and recover the data. You should file a formal grievance with the dean." Mia froze. The pout vanished, replaced by a look of profound, stupid confusion. "What? No, I can't do that. Julian's dad is the primary benefactor for the new athletics wing. If I report him, it'll be a disaster. You know how this works. Just fix it. Like you always do." I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. I looked down at her, seeing for the first time not a friend in need, but a liability in the making. "No," I said. The word was a single, clean strike of a hammer. "I'm busy with my Ivy League applications, Mia. I don't have time to manage your accidents anymore." I picked up my MacBook, the aluminum cold against my palms, and walked toward the exit. "Elena. Wait." Mia hissed behind me, but I didn't turn. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library and stepped into the sun-drenched hallway of St. Jude's. The air was bright, filled with the sounds of privilege and high-stakes ambition. The trap was set. But this time, I wasn't the one walking into it. I walked past the trophy case, my reflection in the glass a ghost of the girl I used to be. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from an unknown number: "Meet me behind the gym in 10. I have a job for you. Don't be late. J.S. Julian Sterling. The architect of my murder." I looked at the message, a cold smile touching my lips. He thought he was summoning a servant. He had no idea he was inviting his executioner to dinner. I didn't delete the text. I archived it. Step 1, collection of evidence. Step 2, total erasure. The air behind the St. Jude's gymnasium tasted of damp earth and unearned confidence. It was a secluded strip of gravel and shadow, shielded from the prying eyes of the faculty by a row of meticulously manicured hedges. I checked my watch, a cheap, stainless steel Casio that felt like a relic on this campus of Patek Philippe's. Julian Sterling was exactly 4 minutes late. In his world, punctuality was a concession made only by the desperate. I leaned against the brick wall, the cold seep of the masonry through my blazer serving as a grounding wire. Inside my bag, the cooling fan of my MacBook hummed, a soft, mechanical purr that was the only honest sound in this zip code. Finally, the crunch of gravel. Julian Sterling rounded the corner with the lazy, sweeping gait of a man who owned the horizon. He was wearing his varsity jacket over his shoulders like a cape, the silver embroidery of the Sterling family crest catching the dying afternoon light. Behind him trailed his 2 lieutenants, Liam and Derek, human echoes who existed only to amplify Julian's presence. He stopped 3 feet from me, the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint, acrid tang of a jewel pod preceding him. He didn't look at me, he looked through me, his eyes scanning the perimeter as if checking for paparazzi. "You're late, Elena," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it was a verbal branding. "You're the one who sent the text, Julian," I replied. My voice was a flat line, devoid of the frantic, eager-to-please tremor that had defined our previous timeline. "Make it quick. I have a quantitative analysis seminar in 20 minutes. Julian's brow arched, a microscopic flicker of confusion crossing his face. Usually, I would have apologized. Usually, I would have been clutching my books to my chest like a shield. Today, my arms were crossed, my weight centered. The scholarship girl has a schedule. How charming, Julian sneered, stepping into my personal space. He reached out, his hand, tan and unblemished by actual labor, flicking the lapel of my blazer. "I need a favor. Liam here is having a bit of an issue with the dean's database. His midterms are, let's say, statistically improbable. I need you to go into the back end and perform a little arbitrage on the grades. Move a few decimal points. Bury the logs." I watched his pupils. They were pinned, likely the result of the Adderall he used to maintain his golden boy focus. "You're asking me to commit a felony for Liam's GPA?" I asked. "I'm asking you to do your job," Julian corrected, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. "I pay for your lunches, Elena. My father's foundation pays for that laptop in your bag. In this ecosystem, I am the provider, and you are the utility. You don't get to audit the requests." In my first life, I had been blinded by the provider myth. I had seen Julian's proximity as protection. Now, I saw the intellectual property of my mind being harvested by a boy who couldn't even balance his own ledger. "I don't work for free anymore, Julian," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Liam and Derek exchanged a look of panicked amusement. Julian simply stared at me, his jaw tightening until a small muscle in his cheek began to throb. "Excuse me? If I'm a utility, then I require a market rate," I said, stepping away from the wall and closing the distance between us. I could see the individual pores on his skin, the vanity in his gaze. "You want Liam's grades changed? That's high risk. That requires a 0-day exploit in the school's outdated firewall, one I discovered last week and haven't patched yet. If I get caught, my scholarship is revoked. If you get caught, your father writes a check. The risk-to-reward ratio is skewed." Julian let out a short, barking laugh. "You're negotiating? With me?" "I'm performing a cost-benefit analysis," I replied. "And right now, you're all cost." I reached into my bag and pulled out my MacBook. The aluminum was cold, its surface etched with the faint scratches of 1,000 nights spent coding in the dark. I didn't open it. I just held it between us, a 42-gram weapon of pure logic. I know about the sports book, Julian, I whispered. The color didn't leave his face, it froze. His posture shifted, the varsity jacket slipping an inch off his shoulder. I don't know what you're talking about, he hissed, but his eyes were darting toward his friends. The illegal offshore betting ring you've been running out of the chemistry lab's dedicated T1 line, I continued, my voice a clinical scalpel. I noticed the traffic spikes in the system architecture when I was optimizing the school's server for my project. You've been using the school's encrypted tunnel to avoid the state's gambling ban. That's not just a school violation, Julian. That's federal wire fraud. Julian's hand shot out, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into the muscle with a desperate, crushing strength. You listen to me, you little freak. You say one word about that, and I will make sure you're back in the slums before the sun sets. I will bury you. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply looked down at his hand, then back up into his eyes. Your father's fiduciary duty is to the Sterling shareholders, Julian. If his son is indicted for federal crimes, the stock price drops 15% in the first hour. He won't protect you. He'll liquidate you to save the brand. He's a businessman first, a father second. Or have you forgotten the asset stripping he performed on your uncle's estate? Julian's grip slackened. The arrogance was still there, but it was brittle now, a glass mask held together by sheer willpower. What do you want? He spat. Nothing, I said, smoothing the fabric of my blazer where his hand had been. I'm not doing the hack for Liam. And I'm not telling the dean about your gambling, yet. I'm simply informing you that the terms of our ecosystem have changed. You don't summon me. You don't touch me. And from this moment on, you are a ghost to me. I turned on my heel, the gravel crunching under my shoes with a sound like breaking bones. Elena. Julian shouted after me, his voice cracking with a raw, unrefined rage. This isn't over. You're nothing without the Sterling name. You're a scholarship rat. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. As I rounded the corner of the gym, a notification chimed on my phone. I didn't need to look to know what it was. My script had finished its first crawl of Julian's private cloud storage. I stopped in the middle of the quad, the autumn wind whipping my hair across my face. I pulled the phone from my pocket. There it was. A high-resolution image of a ledger, names, amounts, and dates. And at the bottom, a signature that didn't belong to Julian. It belonged to Mia Thornton. The fragile Mia was Julian's bookkeeper. A dark, clinical satisfaction bloomed in my chest. They weren't just bullies, they were a syndicate. And a syndicate could be dismantled from the inside, piece by agonizing piece. I looked up at the main building of St. Jude's, its Gothic spires reaching into the gray sky like claws. In my first life, this place had been a prison. In this life, it was a laboratory. And the first experiment was already underway. I walked toward the dorms, my mind already calculating the next move. But as I passed the dark windows of the chemistry lab, I saw a light flicker. Someone was inside. Not a student, a man in a charcoal suit I didn't recognize. He was holding a tablet, his face obscured by the blue glow of the screen. He looked up, and for a split second, our eyes met through the glass. He didn't look like a teacher. He looked like an auditor. My heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, sharp realization. I wasn't the only ghost in the machine. The St. Jude's cafeteria was less of a dining hall and more of a glass-walled amphitheater designed for the public execution of reputations. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of white truffle oil, bleached linens, and the suffocating pressure of social capital. We didn't eat, we performed. I sat at a peripheral table, a small island of clinical silence in a sea of rehearsed laughter. Before me lay a Niçoise salad. I focused on a single leaf of arugula. It was slightly wilted, a microscopic flaw in an otherwise perfect presentation. I speared it with my fork, noting the resistance of the cellulose, the way the balsamic glaze clung to the dark green veins like oil on a slick. Across the room, Julian Sterling was holding court. He had commandeered the center table, his throne for the afternoon. Beside him sat Mia Thornton. She looked fragile, her hands clasped tightly around a bottle of sparkling water as if it were a life raft. She had been looking at me every 30 seconds for the past 10 minutes, eyes wide, pleading, waiting for the shield to intervene. I didn't look back. I was busy hedging my position. Is there a problem, Julian? Mia's voice drifted across the hall, thin and brittle. Julian didn't answer immediately. He was holding a bottle of Krug Classe d'Ambonne, a champagne that cost more than my father's first car. He held it by the base, his thumb tucked into the punt with the practiced ease of a sommelier. Problem? Julian's voice was a low, melodic purr that silenced the tables around him. No, Mia. I was just thinking about loyalty. About how some people are investments, and some people are just overhead. I adjusted the focal length of the button camera pinned to my blazer. The feed was streaming directly to an encrypted cloud server I'd set up an hour ago. The optics of the next 60 seconds would be worth a fortune in the coming weeks. Julian stood up. The movement was slow, a deliberate disruption of the room's equilibrium. He stepped behind Mia, his hand resting on the back of her chair. With a flick of his wrist, he stripped the foil from the champagne bottle. The silver paper fell to the floor like a shed skin. The cork didn't pop, it sighed, a $500 exhalation of carbon dioxide and fermented grapes. You were Elena's shadow, weren't you, Mia? Julian asked. He tilted the bottle. I watched through the lens of the camera, my pulse remaining a steady, flat 60 beats per minute. The physics of the pour were fascinating. The first stream of pale gold liquid hit the top of Mia's head, shattering into 1,000 microscopic diamonds. It wasn't a splash, it was an inundation. I watched the liquid travel. It moved in slow-motion rivulets through her blonde hair, darkening the strands from honey to a muddy gold. It pooled in the hollow of her collarbone, then overflowed, soaking into the silk of her $400 blouse. The fabric became translucent, clinging to her skin with a cold, suffocating intimacy. The scent hit me from across the room, the yeast, the bruised apple, the sharp, acidic sting of expensive waste. Mia froze. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She simply sat there as the Krug cascaded over her face, stinging her eyes, dripping off the tip of her nose and into her untasted soup. The sound was a soft, rhythmic hysteropiss against the quiet of the hall. You look like a drowned rat, Mia, Julian whispered, his voice carrying perfectly in the dead silence. I wonder, if the scholarship girl isn't here to save you, what exactly is your value to me? He set the empty bottle on the table with a sharp, resonant clack. Finally, the room erupted. Not into outrage, but into a cruel, staccato chorus of laughter. It was the sound of a pack identifying a weak link. Mia's chair scraped against the floor, a jagged, desperate sound. She stood up, shivering, the champagne stinging her eyes. She looked directly at me. This was the moment in the old life where I would have stood up, thrown my tray at Julian, and marched Mia to the infirmary. I would have taken the detention. I would have taken the blame. Instead, I speared another piece of tuna. I chewed slowly, the texture of the fish dry and meticulously analyzed. Elena. Mia's voice was a ragged sob. Please. I looked up, my expression as flat as a stagnant pond. You should probably go to the restroom, Mia. Silk doesn't react well to acidity. If you don't rinse that blouse in the next 3 minutes, the fibers will liquidate. It would be a shame to lose such an expensive piece. Julian's laughter was a sharp, jagged edge. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and a new, distorted kind of respect. You heard the expert, Mia. Run along. Before you lose your value entirely. Mia turned and ran, her wet heels squeaking against the polished floor, leaving a trail of champagne and broken dignity behind her. Julian leaned across the space between our tables. He picked up a crystal glass from a nearby setting and began to twirl it between his fingers. The light from the atrium caught the facets, casting a prismatic net across his face. "You're becoming very interesting, Elena," he said. "The ice is a good look on you. But don't think for a second that your silence makes us allies. You're still just a fiduciary risk I haven't closed out yet." "I don't seek allies, Julian," I said, setting my fork down with a precise, silent grace. "Allies are just liabilities you haven't betrayed yet. I prefer data." "And what does your data tell you about this?" he asked, gesturing to the room, to the power he wielded like a blunt instrument. "It tells me that your social capital is over-leveraged," I replied, standing up. "You're spending your reputation on small, petty cruelties because you're scared of the big, looming debt coming your way. It's a classic sign of a failing firm." I picked up my tray. I didn't look at the students who were still whispering. I didn't look at the champagne stain on the floor. "Wait," Julian called out, his voice losing its playful edge. "What debt?" I stopped at the exit, the heavy glass doors reflecting a version of me that was sharper, colder, and entirely unrecognizable to the girl who died in the alley. "The audit is coming, Julian," I said, my voice a clinical whisper. "And you're significantly undercapitalized." I pushed open the door and stepped out into the hallway. My phone vibrated. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The video was uploaded. 1080p, 60 frames per second. Every humiliating second of Julian's tantrum was now a permanent part of the digital ledger. But I wasn't going to leak it. Not yet. In finance, you don't sell when the market is volatile. You wait for the peak. You wait until the asset is at its most valuable, and then you liquidate your enemies with a single, devastating stroke. I walked toward the computer lab, the sound of my own footsteps echoing like the ticking of a countdown. The decoupling was complete. Mia was no longer my responsibility. Julian was no longer my protector. I was the only ghost in the machine now. And I was about to rewrite the code. As I logged into the school's main terminal, I noticed a new directory in the root folder. It was encrypted with a 256-bit AES key, standard, but the file name made my blood turn to ice, Vance_project_recovery. Someone had been digging into my files. Someone who knew my real name. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my pupils. The auditor from the chemistry lab wasn't just watching Julian. He was watching me. The Winter Tech Expo was a temple built of brushed aluminum and unbridled ego. Held at the glass-vaulted Javits Center, the air vibrated with $1 million hum, the collective frequency of 1,000 startups screaming for venture capital. High-intensity LED strips cut through the artificial fog, casting jagged, electric blue shadows across the faces of men in $3,000 sneakers and women in wearable tech that shimmered like dragon scales. I moved through the crowd like a glitch in the Matrix. I was wearing a black I'd found in a vintage shop on the Lower East Side. It had cost me $40 and 6 hours of meticulous tailoring. The fabric was a heavy, matte wool that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Around me, the socialites of St. Jude's drifted in $10,000 silk gowns that whispered of old money and inherited boredom. They were peacocks, I was a scalpel. I spotted Julian Sterling near the main stage. He was holding a flute of warm Prosecco, his face animated by a rehearsed, predatory charm. He was cornering a group of investors from a mid-tier private equity firm, pitching some half-baked crypto real estate platform he'd likely bullied a junior into designing. The ROI on the Sterling token is projected at 30% by Q3, Julian's voice drifted through the speakers, oily and confident. We're looking for a lead investor for the Series A round. It's a closed cap table. I didn't stop to listen. I knew his cap table was a fiction. I knew his burn rate was astronomical. I knew Julian Sterling wasn't looking for investors, he was looking for a bailout to cover his offshore betting debts. I turned toward the back of the hall, toward the Founders Lounge. This was the inner sanctum, a space guarded by two men with earpieces and a zero-tolerance policy for the uninvited. My target was Marcus Thorne. Thorne was the kingmaker of Silicon Valley, a man who didn't just invest in companies, He engineered the future. He was known for a clinical, almost sociopathic devotion to efficiency. He didn't take meetings. He took opportunities. I waited. I watched the door. My pulse was a rhythmic, unhurried thrum against the bone of my wrist. At 9:15 p.m., Thorne stepped out of the lounge, flanked by a phalanx of assistants. He was shorter than the magazine suggested, with a face like weather-beaten granite and eyes that looked like they were constantly auditing the world for errors. He made a beeline for the exit, his pace a brisk, mechanical march. Julian Sterling saw him too. Julian broke away from his group, his face lighting up with a desperate, hungry light. He intercepted Thorne near the row of high-end server rack displays. "Mr. Thorne." Julian Sterling. "We met at the Hamptons fundraiser last July," Julian said, his hand extended, his voice a perfect pitch of subservient arrogance. "I have a $1 million pledge for your Ocean Cleanup Foundation, and a proposal for a seed round that I think would." Thorne didn't even slow down. He didn't look at Julian's hand. He didn't look at Julian's face. He looked at his watch. "I don't discuss business on the floor, Mr. Sterling." "Send a deck to my office," Thorne snapped, his voice a dry rasp. "But sir, the Series A valuation is," Julian's voice cracked, a microscopic fissure in his golden boy mask. I stepped into Thorne's path. I didn't offer my hand. I didn't offer a pledge. I held up my tablet, the screen already glowing with a dark mode terminal. "Mr. Thorne," I said. My voice was a flat, low-frequency hum that cut through the gala's noise. "Julian Sterling wants to buy your time. I want to save your company $400 million in litigation costs and a massive SEC indictment." Thorne stopped. The phalanx of assistants came to a halt like a derailed train. Thorne's gaze shifted from his watch to my face. He didn't see a scholarship girl. He saw a threat. Or a solution. "You have 10 seconds, Thorne said. "Your recent acquisition of Solstice data has a zero-day exploit in the core encryption layer," I said, my thumb swiping across the screen. "Your due diligence team missed a backdoor hard-coded into the kernel. At 12:01 a.m. tonight, a script will trigger that will dump your client's metadata onto the dark web. I've written the 50-line patch. It's on this screen." I held the tablet out. Thorne reached for it. His fingers were dry, the skin like parchment. He took the device, his eyes scanning the code with a terrifying, high-speed focus. The silence between us was a vacuum. I watched the reflection of the code in his pupils, lines of green text scrolling over the black glass. I could smell the faint, bitter scent of the espresso he'd clearly been drinking all night. Julian stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Mr. Thorne, ignore her. She's a thief. She's a scholarship student who hacked our school's server. She's a liability." I didn't look at Julian. I kept my eyes on Thorne. "The patch uses a recursive encryption loop to seal the backdoor without alerting the original author," I said, my voice clinical. "It's elegant. It's invisible. And it's yours, provided we discuss the terms of my internship at Thorne Ventures." Thorne looked up from the tablet. A slow, terrifying smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of kindness, it was the smile of a wolf recognizing another predator. "This isn't an internship, kid," Thorne said. "This is a rescue mission." He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a card. It wasn't paper. It was a heavy, cold slab of black titanium. No name. Just a private number etched in silver. He didn't hand it to me. He dropped it onto the screen of my tablet. The sound was a sharp, metallic clink that echoed in the sudden silence. "Call my personal line at 6 a.m., Thorne said. "If you're a second late, the deal is void." He turned and walked away, his phalanx closing in behind him. He didn't look back at Julian. Julian stood there, his hands still half extended, his face the color of spoiled milk. The Prosecco in his other hand was trembling, the bubbles dying in the glass. I picked up the titanium card. It felt heavy in my hand, a literal weight of power. I looked at Julian. You were saying something about a seed round, Julian? I asked. My voice was a whisper, but in the hollow space of his defeat, it sounded like a thunderclap. Julian's jaw worked, but no sound came out. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He realized, for the first time, that he wasn't playing a game with a classmate. He was being audited by an expert. You stole that, Julian hissed, his voice a ragged whisper. You've been digging into Solstice? That's corporate espionage. I'll call the FBI. Call them, I said, stepping closer until I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. But first, ask yourself, if the FBI looks at my logs, what else will they find on your school's T1 line? The sports betting? The wire fraud? The ledger Mia has been keeping for you? I leaned in, the scent of the gala's expensive lilies suddenly nauseating. Thorne doesn't care where the code came from, Julian. He cares that it works. That's the difference between us. You play with people. I play with systems. And systems always win. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence on the polished concrete. I didn't feel triumph. Triumph was a messy, emotional distraction. I felt the cold, sharp satisfaction of a successful hostile takeover. I walked out of the Javits Center and into the biting Manhattan wind. The city lights stretched out before me like a circuit board waiting to be programmed. My phone vibrated. I pulled it out. A notification from the Aegis script, data extraction from Sterling Private Cloud, 100% complete. Decrypting now. The audit was no longer coming. It was here. I sat in the back of a yellow cab, the titanium card cool against my thigh. I opened the newly decrypted file. It wasn't just betting logs. It was a series of wire transfers from a trust fund that didn't belong to the Sterlings. The names on the account were Elena Vance, and a woman I hadn't seen in years. My mother. Julian Sterling hadn't just stolen my future. He had been harvesting my family's estate for a decade. A cold, absolute darkness settled in my chest. Execution was no longer enough. I wanted total annihilation. The morning of December 14th arrived with a pale, anemic sun that bled no warmth onto the frost-covered Gothic spires of St. Jude's. Inside the hallways, the air was thick with a frantic, artificial cheer, the annual winter charity drive. A heavy, locked steel box sat in the dean's office, allegedly containing over $50,000 in cash and pledged checks from the city's elite. To the students, it was a symbol of philanthropy. To Julian Sterling, it was a life jacket for a man drowning in a sea of his own embezzlement. I stood by my locker, 414. The dial was cold under my thumb, its metallic clicks sharp against the morning silence. Right to 22. Left past 0 to 08. Right to 16. The tumblers fell with a heavy, muffled thud, a sound of mechanical finality. I didn't open it to get my books. I reached into the upper interior vent and checked the positioning of the Aegis 01. It was a motion-activated camera no larger than a shirt button, its 4K lens angled perfectly to capture anyone standing in the 3-foot radius of the door. Beside it, I placed a single neon pink post-it note on the center shelf. I closed the locker and walked toward the cafeteria, my heels echoing like a countdown. Julian was there, cornered near the vending machines. He looked feral. The golden boy was fraying at the edges, his tie was knotted too tight, and the skin beneath his eyes was a bruised, translucent purple. He was holding a thick manila envelope, his knuckles white against the paper. Mia stood in front of him, her face a mask of practiced, fragile obedience. I watched them through the reflection in a trophy case. Julian leaned in, his voice a low, jagged hiss. He shoved the envelope into Mia's hands. I saw her flinch, her fingers trembling as she clutched the weight of the stolen $50,000 to her chest. He kissed her cheek, a transaction of false affection that made my skin crawl, and disappeared through the south exit. Mia stood alone for a heartbeat, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Then, she began her walk toward the D-wing. Toward my locker. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I had already reprogrammed the game. I turned and walked straight to the security office. Officer Higgins was a man who took his fiduciary duty to the school's safety with a grim, retired cop seriousness. He was currently staring at a bank of low-res monitors, a lukewarm cup of burnt coffee in his hand. "Officer Higgins," I said, my voice a clinical, urgent hum. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just saw something unsettling in the D-wing." A student was carrying a thick manila envelope, acting extremely paranoid near the 410-row lockers. Given the rumors about the charity fund, I thought I should report it immediately. Higgins was out of his chair before I finished the sentence. He grabbed his radio, his face hardening into a mask of professional suspicion. "Which locker, kid?" "D-wing." "Near 414, I said. I followed him at a calculated distance, my pace measured and silent. As we rounded the corner, the scene was exactly as the script intended. Mia was standing in front of my locker. She had it open. She was reaching inside, the manila envelope halfway toward the shelf. Suddenly, she froze. From my vantage point, I saw her entire body lock up as if she'd been hit by a high-voltage current. Her head tilted slowly, her eyes locking onto the neon-pink post-it note I'd left for her. "Smile for the camera, Mia. Say cheese." Panic, pure and unfiltered, shattered her face. She saw the tiny black lens of the Aegis 01 blinking back at her. She realized, in a single, gut-wrenching second, that she hadn't walked into a trap for me, she had walked into an audit for herself. She heard Higgins' heavy boots pounding the linoleum. She had no time to think. She slammed my locker shut, spun around, and in a blind, frantic reflex, tore open her own locker, 411, 3 doors down, and shoved the envelope inside just as Higgins turned the corner. "Haze. Hands where I can see them." Higgins roared. Mia spun around, her face the color of bone, her back pressed hard against the cold metal of her locker. I didn't do anything. I was just getting my chem book." "Open it," Higgins commanded, his hand resting on his belt. "No. It's private. You can't." Mia's voice was a ragged, hysterical shriek. Dean Miller appeared a moment later, his face a deep, dangerous magenta. He didn't say a word, he simply pointed at the locker. Mia's hands were shaking so violently she couldn't even grip the dial. Higgins stepped in, his movements efficient and brutal. He spun the combination, a code the school had on file, and ripped the door open. The manila envelope sat right on top of her textbook, heavy and damning. Higgins grabbed it, tore it open, and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, all neatly banded with the dean's official stamp. Well, Higgins muttered, the sound of the cash crinkling in the silent hallway like a death knell. "Looks like we found our charity thief." "No. It wasn't me. I swear." Mia collapsed to her knees, her sobs echoing off the lockers. "It was Julian. Julian Sterling gave it to me. He told me to hide it in Elena's locker. He said he loved me. He said he'd protect me." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of students who had gathered to watch the collapse. Julian Sterling chose that exact moment to push through to the front. He looked at Mia on the floor, he looked at the money, and he looked at the dean. His survival instinct was a cold, mechanical thing. "What are you talking about, Mia?" Julian asked. His voice was a masterpiece of manufactured outrage, steady and hollow. "Are you insane? You stole the school's funds and now you're trying to pin it on me just because I wouldn't take you to the gala? That's pathetic." Mia's jaw dropped. The betrayal hit her with the physical force of a high-speed collision. Julian, please, you promised." "I promised you nothing," Julian spat, looking at her with genuine, unadulterated disgust. He turned to Dean Miller. "Sir, I've been in the cafeteria for the last 20 minutes. I have 10 witnesses who can verify that." This girl has been obsessed with me for months. She's clearly lost her mind. I stood in the shadows of the cross hallway, my arms folded, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. I didn't rush in to defend her. I didn't offer a comforting look. I simply stood there, an observer watching the ruin she had built with her own 2 hands. I caught Mia's eye for a split second. I raised my eyebrows, gave a slow, mocking tilt of my head, and then turned my back on her, walking away as her screams and the sound of handcuffs clicking filled the air. The wire fraud investigation wouldn't stop at the locker. The Aegis 01 hadn't just caught her face, it had recorded the serial numbers on the bills I'd surreptitiously marked with a fluorescent pen. And those numbers would lead back to Julian's private ledger. I walked back to the library, my mind already running the next simulation. The tracking beacon I'd hidden in the manila envelope was still active. It wasn't just a piece of hardware, it was a digital trail that led directly to Julian's offshore betting accounts. He thought he'd sacrificed a pawn to save his king. He had no idea I'd already flipped the board. I sat at my terminal, watching the red dot of the beacon move across the screen. It wasn't moving toward Julian's house. It was moving toward the Sterling Real Estate HQ downtown. My phone vibrated. A text from Julian, "You think you won? My father is on the phone with the DA right now. You're a ghost, Elena. And ghosts get erased." I didn't reply. I just opened the Sterling private ledger and hit send to Marcus Thorne. The audit wasn't over. It was just entering the discovery phase. The administrative wing of St. Jude's smelled of lemon wax, ozone, and the distinct, metallic scent of high-stakes panic. It was a space designed for quiet discipline, but today, the air felt pressurized, as if the glass walls of the trophy cases were on the verge of shattering. I stood by the oak-paneled entrance, my weight shifted slightly onto my heels, my posture a study in calculated invisibility. Inside the dean's office, the shadows were long and sharp. Julian Sterling sat in a low leather chair, his legs crossed, a faint, arrogant smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth. He was waiting for the cavalry. He believed that his name was an impenetrable aegis, that the Sterling proxy would override the reality of the stolen manila envelope. Then, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open with a violent, percussive force. Richard Sterling didn't walk into a room, he annexed it. He was a man composed of sharp angles and charcoal gray wool, his presence a dark sun that drew all the oxygen toward him. Behind him trailed a phalanx of 3 corporate attorneys, their briefcases snapping in rhythmic unison with his stride. Julian stood up, the smirk widening into a look of relieved triumph. "Dad, thank God. This scholarship girl and Mia have orchestrated this insane." Richard didn't look at his son. He didn't even break his stride. He walked straight to Dean Miller's desk, his movements as precise and terrifying as a guillotine blade. "Dean Miller," Richard said. His voice was a dry, baritone rasp, the sound of tectonic plates grinding together. "I've reviewed the files sent to my office this morning. The betting logs. The wire fraud evidence. The CCTV footage of the locker corridor." Julian's smirk faltered. A microscopic bead of sweat formed at his temple, sliding down into his sideburn. "Files? Dad, whatever you saw, it's fabricated. Elena is a hacker, she." Richard finally turned. He looked at Julian, and for a heartbeat, the room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. He reached out and adjusted Julian's tie. His fingers were steady, the movement slow and clinical. He tightened the silk knot until Julian's breath hitched, the boy's face turning a pale, mottled pink. "A businessman's first fiduciary duty is to the health of the firm, Julian," Richard whispered, his voice carrying a lethal, focused chill. "Not to the liabilities that threaten it. Even when those liabilities share his DNA." "Dad, what are you doing?" Julian's voice was a ragged, desperate squeak. Richard didn't answer. He turned back to the dean and his team of lawyers. "As of 10 a.m. this morning, the Sterling Family Trust has initiated a formal disinheritance protocol against Julian Sterling. He is no longer an agent of the firm. He has no access to the Sterling Legal Defense Fund. He is a private citizen, and he will face the consequences of his own inefficiencies. The air seemed to vanish from Julian's lungs. He stumbled back, his hand catching the edge of a mahogany side table. You're cutting me off? For a school theft? It's 50 grand, Dad. You spend that on wine. It isn't about the money, you arrogant child, Richard spat, the first flash of genuine rage breaking through his icy veneer. It's about the optics. Marcus Thorne has already pulled out of the Sterling waterfront project. He cited a lack of internal controls and moral rot. The SEC is already sniffing around our offshore accounts because your gambling logs led them to the private server. You didn't just steal from the school. You poisoned the brand. I watched Julian's face through the glass. The golden boy was disintegrating. His features seemed to melt, the arrogance replaced by a raw, naked terror that made him look like a frightened toddler. Dad, please. Julian reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grab Richard's sleeve. Richard's reaction was explosive. He swung his hand in a short, brutal arc. The slap wasn't just a sound, it was an event. It was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the oak panels and seemed to reverberate in my own marrow. Julian's head snapped to the side, his varsity jacket slipping entirely off his shoulders, his body crumpling back into the leather chair. Silence followed. Not the quiet of a library, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a grave. Julian sat there, his hand clutched to his cheek, his eyes wide and leaking tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He looked up at his father, searching for a trace of mercy, but Richard Sterling was already looking at his watch. Higgins, Richard said, not looking at Julian. Call the NYPD. Tell them the Sterling family will not be seeking leniency. In fact, we will be filing a class action suit against my son for the damages he's caused to our corporate reputation. Richard turned and walked toward the door. As he passed me, he stopped. He looked at me for 3 long, agonizing seconds. He didn't see a scholarship girl. He saw the architect. He saw the person who had sent Marcus Thorne the decryption key. You have a very surgical mind, Miss Vance, Richard said, his voice a low, respectful rasp. It's a shame you aren't on my payroll. I suspect we could have avoided a great deal of mess. The mess was already there, Mr. Sterling, I replied, my voice a flat, clinical hum. I just turned on the lights. He gave a single, stiff nod and walked out, his lawyers trailing behind him like shadows returning to their master. 10 minutes later, the NYPD arrived. 2 officers in dark navy uniforms, their belts jingling with the cold, mechanical sounds of authority. Julian didn't fight them. He didn't even look up as they pulled his arms behind his back. Click. Click. The sound of the handcuffs was the final period at the end of Julian's sentence. They led him out through the main hallway, past the rows of students who were already uploading the footage to every social media platform in existence. The golden boy of St. Jude's, the heir to the Sterling Empire, was being marched out like a common thief, his head bowed, his face stained with tears and the red imprint of his father's hand. He saw me one last time as he reached the exit. His eyes locked onto mine. There was no rage left, only a hollow, echoing void. He realized, in that moment, that he wasn't being arrested for a crime. He was being erased from the system he thought he owned. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply watched him go, my pulse remaining a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. I walked back to the computer lab, my mind already calculating the next phase. Julian was gone. Mia was in a holding cell. The Sterlings were in a PR death spiral. The board was nearly clear. I logged into my terminal and opened the file labeled Aegis_protocol_beta. The high school drama was over. The corporate war was about to begin. My phone vibrated. A message from Marcus Thorne, the Sterling stock is dropping. 12% in the first hour. I'm initiating the hostile takeover of their tech division at noon. Your seat on the board is ready, Elena. Don't be late. I leaned back in the chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes like a cold, digital fire. In my first life, I died in an alley, a ghost of a girl who never fought back. In this life, I was the one holding the scalpel. And the audit was just beginning. I watched the red and green tickers of the stock market move across my screen. Sterling Real Estate was bleeding. But as I traced the flow of their liquidated assets, I noticed a phantom account, a ghost in the machine that was buying up their debt faster than Marcus Thorne. It wasn't a bank. It wasn't a firm. It was a private trust registered in Switzerland under a name I hadn't seen since the day of my murder. Thornton_estate. Mia wasn't just a bookkeeper. She was a beneficiary. A cold, sharp realization pierced my chest. The war wasn't over. It had just changed fronts. Time did not pass in the 5 years following the St. Jude's collapse, it was processed. I didn't celebrate my graduation. I didn't attend a single alumni gala. While Julian Sterling sat in a federal youth detention center and Mia Thornton was shuttled between high-security psychiatric wards, I was in a basement in Palo Alto, staring into the flickering blue heart of the machine. I wasn't living, I was iterating. The air in my first office, a windowless concrete box behind a laundromat, smelled of ozone, burnt coffee, and the metallic heat of overclocked processors. I lived in the hum. My pulse had become synchronized with the staccato rhythm of the server racks, a steady, unhurried 60 beats per minute that never wavered, even when the bank account hit zero. By the third year, the Aegis protocol wasn't just a script, it was an apex predator. I sat in the center of the server room on the night of the IPO. The temperature was kept at a constant, sterile 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against my skin, keeping the nerves sharp and the mind clinical. I was wearing a black silk slip dress, my bare feet resting on the raised floor tiles. Beneath me, miles of fiber optic cables pulsed with the frantic, invisible traffic of $1 billion valuation. The micro-action of the launch was a ritual of cold, hard logic. I reached for the master console. The keyboard was a bespoke mechanical build, weighted keys that required exactly 55 grams of force to actuate. I rested my index finger on the Enter key. I could feel the microscopic texture of the PBT plastic, the slight grain against my skin. I didn't press it. I waited. I watched the countdown on the wall, red digital numbers bleeding into the darkness. 003, 002, 001. I depressed the key. The sound was a sharp, mechanical thwack that echoed in the hollow space of the room. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the server racks began to scream. A high-pitched, melodic whine as the cooling fan spun up to maximum RPM. The blue LEDs on the front panels shifted from a steady glow to a frantic, staccato flickering, a digital heartbeat at 1,000 cycles per second. I watched the monitor. The ticker for Aegis appeared on the NASDAQ feed. $22, $28.50, $42.10. A wave of phantom heat bloomed in my chest, not joy, but the sensation of a system reaching equilibrium. The numbers were no longer abstract, they were weapons. By noon, Aegis Protocol had a market cap of $2.4 billion. I was no longer a scholarship rat. I was the architect of the gate. I spent the next 2 years as a ghost in the Manhattan skyline. I didn't buy a mansion. I bought a 15% stake in the firm that held the Sterling family's remaining debt. I watched from the shadows as Richard Sterling tried to pivot into green energy, his empire crumbling under the weight of the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings I had quietly facilitated through a series of anonymous whistleblower reports to the SEC. Every move was surgical. When Sterling Real Estate finally hit the liquidation phase, I didn't send a broker. I went myself. The auction was held in a sterile boardroom in the New York Stock Exchange. The air was dry, filtered until it tasted of nothing. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the table, his granite face impassive as he watched the vultures pick at the bones of the Sterling legacy. He looked at me, and for the first time in 5 years, he gave a microscopic, approving nod. The Sterling Tower, the auctioneer said, his voice a droning monotone. Current bid stands at $180 million. I didn't raise a paddle. I didn't speak. I simply tapped a button on my phone. A notification appeared on Marcus Thorne's tablet. He looked at it, then at the auctioneer. "The bid is closed," Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. "Aegis Protocol has exercised its right of first refusal through a debt equity swap. The building is officially off the market. The Sterling Tower was mine." I walked through the lobby of the building an hour later. The Sterling name had already been stripped from the granite exterior, leaving only a jagged, pale scar in the stone. The air inside smelled of dust and defeat. The elevators were locked, the gold plating on the doors tarnished by neglect. I didn't feel the need to. I felt the need for quantitative analysis. I took the stairs to the 60th floor. My lungs didn't burn, my breathing remained a deep, rhythmic cycle that tasted of the building's cold, stagnant history. When I reached the penthouse office, Richard Sterling's inner sanctum, the view of Manhattan was obscured by a thick layer of grime on the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked to the red mahogany desk. It was the same desk Julian had cowered behind while his father slapped the arrogance out of his face. I ran my hand over the surface. The wood was cold, the grain tight. I could still see the faint indentation in the leather where Richard's heavy signet ring had struck the wood 5 years ago. I sat in the chair. It was too large, designed to make the occupant feel like a god. I felt nothing but the ergonomic failure of the lumbar support. My phone vibrated. A report from my private investigation team. Subject A: Julian Sterling released from federal custody 14 months ago. Current employment: entry-level custodial services at Metro Maintenance Corporation. No fixed address. Subject B: Mia Thornton released from residential treatment 6 months ago. Currently residing in a state-funded halfway house in Queens. Seeking employment in retail. I leaned back, the leather creaking under my weight. I had achieved market dominance. I had liquidated the assets of my enemies. I had reclaimed the trust fund that Julian had been harvesting, restoring a $40 million estate to my mother's name. By every metric of the world I lived in, the audit was complete. But as I looked out at the city lights, now shimmering through the grime as the sun began to set, I realized that the surgical removal of their power wasn't the final act. A system isn't truly secure until the vulnerabilities are not just patched, but monitored. I picked up the phone on the desk. It was a heavy, old-fashioned landline, its cord tangled like a dead vine. I dialed the number for the building's new facilities management firm. "This is Elena Vance," I said. My voice was a low, clinical hum that filled the empty office. "I want to review the roster for the night shift maintenance crew for the executive floors. Specifically, the third-party contractors." "Of course, Ms. Vance. Is there a problem?" "No," I said, my gaze fixed on the red ticker of the stock market scrolling across my phone. "I just want to ensure our internal controls are absolute. Send me the names. Now." I hung up and waited. 10 minutes later, the email arrived. I scrolled through the list of names, my eyes scanning the text with the speed of a high-frequency trading algorithm. And there it was. Row 42. Employee number 8821, Julian Sterling. Shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Area, floors 55 to 60. A slow, freezing satisfaction settled in my marrow. It wasn't the heat of revenge, it was the cold, absolute certainty of a loop being closed. He was coming here. To my tower. To scrub the floors of the woman he had murdered in the rain. I stood up and walked to the window. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, the Manhattan skyline reflected in my pupils like a grid of light. "The audit isn't over, Julian," I whispered, the words fogging the glass for a split second before vanishing. "The discovery phase has just begun." I heard a sound from the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic thud-clack of a janitor's cart. It was early. The shift didn't start for another hour. I didn't turn around. I simply watched the reflection in the dark glass as the door to the penthouse office creaked open. A man in a stained blue uniform stood in the threshold, his shoulders slumped, his face obscured by the shadow of the brim of his cap. He didn't see me. He only saw the red mahogany desk. My pulse jumped, a single, sharp spike to 85. Not out of fear. Out of hunger. The storm outside the 60th floor windows was a violent, formless black, punctuated only by the jagged white fractures of lightning. Each strike illuminated the office for a fraction of a second, reflecting the clinical perfection of my red mahogany desk in the glass. It felt like a mirror of the night I died, the same rain, the same cold, the same smell of wet asphalt. But here, 600 feet above the pavement, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile 68 degrees. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, my fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup. The steam from the espresso, triple shot, no sugar, rose in a thin, rhythmic plume, the scent of dark-roasted beans and high-altitude extraction filling my lungs. I watched the reflection of the door behind me. Julian Sterling didn't enter the room with a bang. He entered with a squeak, the sound of a cheap rubber-wheeled janitor's cart dragging across Italian marble. I didn't turn around. I listened to the micro-sounds of his labor. The heavy, wet slap of a mop being dropped into a bucket of gray, chemical-scented water. The clink of a spray bottle hitting the metal rim. The sound of a man who had lost the habit of breathing deeply. His respiration was shallow, a ragged, whistling sound that indicated a body worn down by years of cheap tobacco and the humid air of federal holding cells. He moved toward the desk, my desk. In his mind, he was likely still a Sterling, performing a task that was beneath him but necessary for survival. He didn't see me as a person, he saw me as a shadow silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. The voice was a ruin. The sharp, aristocratic edge that had once commanded the quad at St. Jude's was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated rasp. It was the sound of a man who had spent 5 years learning to apologize for his own existence. "I didn't think anyone would be up here this late," he continued, his words punctuated by the rhythmic swish-swish of a microfiber cloth against the mahogany. "The agency said the executive floor would be vacant after 10. I took a sip of the coffee. The bitterness was a clean, sharp line against my tongue. I watched him in the reflection of the glass. He was hunched over, his varsity shoulders now slumped into a permanent curve of submission. His hands, once soft and manicured, were red and cracked from the industrial-grade bleach. He was scrubbing the very spot where his father had signed the disinheritance papers. "Julian," I said. The name was a single, low-frequency pulse. The cloth stopped moving. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear the faint, electrical hum of the server racks in the walls. I watched his reflection. His head tilted slowly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the familiarity of the voice. He didn't look up yet. He stared at the polished wood of the desk, his reflection staring back at him through a layer of dust. I beg your pardon," he stammered, the rasp in his voice tightening into a knot of fear. I slowly turned around. The light from a nearby desk lamp caught the sharp, tailored lines of my charcoal blazer and the cold, gold glitter of the Patek Philippe on my wrist. I stood perfectly still, my posture a study in absolute market dominance. Julian Sterling looked up. It was a slow-motion collapse of reality. I watched the recognition travel through his nervous system like a high-speed data transfer. First, the pupils dilated, his gray eyes widening until the whites were visible all the way around. Then, the jaw slackened, his mouth hanging open in a silent, stupid gasp. Finally, the color drained from his face, leaving him a mottled, waxy gray, the color of a man who had just seen the ghost of his own future. "Elena," he whispered. "Ms. Vance," I corrected. My voice was a flat, clinical hum. He took a step back, his hand knocking over a bottle of glass cleaner. It hit the floor with a hollow thud, the blue liquid spreading across the marble like a digital error. He didn't even notice. His eyes were fixed on mine, searching for the scholarship girl he had once bullied, the girl he had tried to bury in a charity fund trap. He didn't find her. He found the architect of his foreclosure. I I didn't know, he said, his hands beginning to shake so violently he had to grip the handle of his mop for support. The agency, they just said the new CEO wanted the executive floors done by a specialist. I didn't know it was you. The agency is a subsidiary of Aegis Protocol, Julian, I said, taking another measured sip of my coffee. I hand-selected the maintenance roster myself. I like to keep my vulnerabilities under constant audit. He looked around the room, the luxury of the penthouse suddenly becoming a cage. You bought the tower. My father's tower. Your father's tower was a distressed asset with a massive default risk, I said, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. My heels clicked against the marble like a metronome. I simply performed a surgical liquidate of the debt. It wasn't a purchase, Julian. It was a recovery of stolen property. I stopped 2 feet from him. The scent of the janitor's cart, bleach, old rags, and cheap floor wax, was a sickening contrast to the expensive sandalwood and ozone of my office. Julian looked down at my shoes, then at the mop in his hand, the absolute humiliation of the role reversal hitting him like a physical weight. I'm sorry, he cried, the tears finally breaking through his bloodshot eyes. I'm so sorry, Elena. For everything. The gambling, the money, the way I treated you. I've lost everything. My dad won't talk to me. I live in a studio in the Bronx. I have 3 heavy felony convictions. I can't even get a bank account. Please, don't fire me. I need this job. I stared at him, watching the way his shoulders shook as he sobbed. I searched for the old rage, the fire that had burned in my chest as I lay dying in the rain 5 years ago. I found nothing. Only a cold, clinical satisfaction. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a bug in the code that had finally been isolated. Apologies are for errors, Julian, I said, my voice ice-thin. What you did was a systemic fiduciary breach. You didn't make a mistake, you made a series of calculated investments in your own narcissism. And now, your accounts are being settled. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low-frequency whisper. I'm not going to fire you, Julian. That would be too efficient. I prefer to keep my liabilities where I can see them. You are going to finish this floor. And tomorrow, you will do it again. And the day after that. I pointed to the floor near the mahogany desk. You missed a spot on the baseboard. There's a smudge of dirt from your cart. Clean it. Julian looked at the baseboard, then back at me. His pride, the last, brittle piece of the Sterling legacy, struggled for a heartbeat. Then, it shattered. He slowly lowered himself onto his knees, the joints in his legs popping with a dry, painful sound. He reached for the microfiber cloth and began to scrub the baseboard, his head bowed, his tears dripping into the gray water of his bucket. I watched him for a long moment, the sound of his frantic scrubbing the only noise in the room besides the storm. I felt a profound sense of equilibrium. The audit was nearly complete. I walked back to my desk and picked up the heavy landline phone. Higgins, I said into the receiver. Is the second subject in position? She's downstairs in the lobby, Ms. Vance, the voice on the other end crackled. Applying for the receptionist position at the front desk, just like you predicted. I looked at Julian's bowed head. Excellent. Send her up. I think it's time for a reunion. I hung up the phone and looked out at the rain. The red ticker on my screen showed a sudden spike in the Thornton Estates Swiss accounts, a massive, unauthorized withdrawal. Mia Thornton wasn't just looking for a job. She was looking for a way back into the server. I looked at Julian, still scrubbing the floor at my feet. You know, Julian, I said, my voice a clinical whisper. Mia is in the lobby. She's coming up. I wonder, after 5 years of silence, what will she say when she sees you on your knees? Julian froze, the cloth poised against the wood. The fear in his eyes was the most beautiful data point I'd ever recorded. The lobby of Vance Plaza was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation, 6 stories of soaring glass, white basalt, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. But up here, on the 60th floor, the atmosphere was different. It was clinical. The scent of Julian's industrial bleach was the only thing that grounded the room in reality. I sat behind the mahogany desk, my fingers laced together, watching the elevator display. The numbers ascended in a rhythmic, silent countdown. 58, 59. 60. The doors chimed, a soft, crystalline G-flat. Mia Thornton stepped into the office. She was wearing a beige trench coat that had seen better days, the hem slightly frayed, her hair pulled back into a tight, defensive bun. She had tried to recreate her fragile look, her makeup applied with a heavy hand to hide the hollows beneath her eyes. But the vanilla perfume she wore was different now. It was no longer the expensive, complex scent of a socialite, it was a cheap, synthetic imitation that smelled like a dying candle. She took 3 steps into the room and stopped. Her gaze swept over the executive suite, taking in the redwood panels and the panoramic view of the storm-lashed city. Then, she saw me. "Elena," she whispered. Her voice was a ragged, high-pitched vibration. I saw the name on the building. I didn't believe it. I thought it was a mistake. A different Vance. "The audit is rarely mistaken, Mia," I said. My voice was a flat, low-frequency hum. I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't acknowledge the rain-drenched coat she was wearing. I simply watched the way her fingers twitched, a frantic, micro-tremor that signaled a nervous system on the verge of a systemic failure. Then, Mia's gaze dropped. She saw Julian. He was still on his knees by the baseboard, the microfiber cloth clutched in his red, cracked hand. He didn't look up at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the gray water in his bucket, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink into the marble. A sharp, hysterical laugh escaped Mia's throat, a jagged sound that cut through the sterile air of the office. "Julian," she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Is that Julian Sterling? The king of St. Jude's?" Julian's jaw tightened, the red imprint of his father's slap from 5 years ago seeming to glow on his cheek in the harsh LED light. He didn't move. He looked like a statue of defeat. "Julian is our lead custodian for the executive floor," I said, leaning back in the chair. The leather creaked with a sound like a settling debt. "He's been quite efficient tonight. He was just finishing the baseboards." Mia turned back to me, her eyes wide and glittering with a mix of terror and a desperate, rising narcissism. "Elena, listen to me. I was a victim too. Julian manipulated me. He forced me to hide that money. I spent 6 months in that ward because of him. My life is a ruin. I just need a chance." I saw the opening for the head receptionist. "I'm good with people. You know that." "I know your fiduciary history, Mia," I said, my voice ice-thin. "And I know about the Swiss account." The blood didn't just leave Mia's face, it seemed to vanish entirely, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly white. The tremor in her hands intensified, her fingers knotting into the fabric of her trench coat. "Account?" she stammered. I don't have an account." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a folder. I didn't toss it. I placed it on the mahogany surface with a slow, deliberate precision. I flipped it open to the final page, a printout of a wire transfer from the Thornton Estate Trust Fund to a private account in Zurich. 2 hours ago, a withdrawal of $2.4 million was attempted, I said, watching her pupils. They were pinned, darting frantically across the room. "The bank flagged it under the sanity clause of your late mother's trust. Since you were legally declared mentally incompetent during your stay in the ward, you are no longer a primary beneficiary. You are a liability. That's my money." Mia shrieked, the fragile facade finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She stepped toward the desk, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. "My mother left that for me. You can't take it." "I didn't take it, Mia," I said, my voice a clinical whisper. "The Aegis Protocol did. As the primary debt holder for the Thornton Estate's outstanding medical and legal fees, I've initiated a prenuptial forfeiture on the grounds of fraud." The funds have been liquidated to settle your mother's debts. You have a net worth of exactly $0. Mia let out a raw, non-human sound, a low, guttural wail that echoed off the glass walls. She lunged toward me, her fingers reaching for my face like claws. Julian moved. He didn't stand up. He swung his mop bucket. The heavy plastic container struck Mia's shins with a wet, heavy thud. Gray, bleach-scented water exploded across her beige coat and her cheap shoes. She stumbled back, slipping on the wet marble, and fell hard onto her hands and knees, right next to Julian. The two of them sat there on the floor, soaked in the runoff of their own failure. I stood up. My heels clicked toward them, the sound of a final audit being tallied. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a single, crinkled piece of paper. It was a $100 bill. It was stained with a dark, brownish-red smear, the dried blood of the girl who had died in the rain 5 years ago. I had kept it in a vacuum-sealed bag until this very moment. I let it go. I watched it fall. It moved in a slow, rhythmic spiral through the sterile air, catching the light for a split second before landing in the puddle of bleach water between Julian and Mia. For the tip, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Mia look at the bill, her eyes widening as she recognized the stain. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers touching the sodden paper. She realized, in that second, that I hadn't just survived. I had remembered every micro-detail of the murder she had orchestrated. The agency called, Mia, I said, walking back toward the window. They've decided you aren't a fit for the receptionist position. But I hear the Metro Maintenance Corp is looking for a new night shift team to handle the basement level. Julian can show you how to use the buffer. Elena, please, Julian whispered, looking at the bloody bill, then at me. Don't do this. The audit is closed, Julian, I said, not turning around. The accounts are settled. I picked up my phone and dialed the security desk. Officer Higgins. Please escort the 2 former employees from the building. And Higgins? Make sure they take the freight elevator. I don't want the marble tracked with their residue. I stood by the window and watched as Higgins and 2 other guards pulled them to their feet. Mia was screaming, a high-pitched, incoherent sound that faded as they were dragged toward the hallway. Julian was silent, his head bowed, his mop bucket left behind like a discarded relic. I watched the reflection in the dark glass as the office door closed. I was alone. I took a deep breath, the sterile, cold air filling my lungs. I reached for my espresso cup, but it was cold. I didn't care. The bitterness was exactly what I needed. My phone vibrated. A final notification from Marcus Thorne: the Thornton estate has been fully absorbed. Total market dominance achieved, Elena. See you at the helipad at 6 o'clock. I looked at the $100 bill on the floor, now floating in a sea of bleach. The girl who died in the alley was finally gone. There was only the architect now. I walked to the balcony door and stepped out into the storm. The wind at 60 stories was a howling, primal force, whipping my hair across my face. I looked down at the city. The lights of Manhattan looked like a grid of green and red tickers, a living ledger that I had finally learned to control. But as I looked toward the East River, I saw a single, black SUV idling on the pier. It was a Sterling model. Richard Sterling wasn't done. He was waiting for me at the zenith. The ascent to the roof was a mechanical ritual. I stood in the center of the private express elevator, the only sound the faint, pressurized hiss of the pneumatic lift. I watched the digital floor indicator climb, a vertical ticker of my own rising market dominance. 58, 59. 60, ph. The doors slid open with a heavy, velvet thud. The air on the helipad was a different element entirely. At 600 feet, the wind didn't blow, it attacked. It was a cold, high-altitude roar that tasted of salt from the Atlantic and the metallic tang of the city's restless energy. The dawn sky was a bruised purple, the light bleeding over the jagged horizon of Queens like an open wound. Richard Sterling was waiting for me. He was standing at the edge of the reinforced concrete pad, his back to the elevator. He was wearing a classic camel hair overcoat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the gale. He looked like a statue of a forgotten era, a monument to a dynasty I had systematically dismantled. I walked toward him, my heels striking the concrete with a rhythmic, clinical precision. I didn't feel the cold. I felt the synergy of the moment, the perfect alignment of the girl who died in the alley and the woman who now owned the sky. Richard turned as I approached. He looked at me, his eyes two chips of frozen flint. He didn't look like a man who had lost his fortune. He looked like a man who was still looking for the leverage. "You're early, Miss Vance," he said. His voice was a dry rasp that barely carried over the roar of the wind. "Punctuality is the first requirement of a successful audit, Mr. Sterling," I replied. He managed a thin, ghostly smile. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound folder. He didn't offer it to me, he held it against his chest like a shield. "I've spent 40 years building the Sterling name," he said, his gaze drifting over the panoramic sweep of Manhattan. "I've survived 3 recessions, 2 federal investigations, and a hostile takeover in the 90s. I thought I knew every predator in this city. I didn't realize the most dangerous one was sitting in my son's chemistry class." "I wasn't a predator then, Richard," I said, stepping closer until the wind whipped my hair across my eyes. "I was a resource. You and your son just didn't know how to manage your assets." "And now?" Richard asked. "Now that you've stripped the Sterling name from the stone and put Julian in a janitor's uniform? Does that satisfy the architect in you?" "Satisfaction isn't a metric I track," I said. "Efficiency is." Julian was a vulnerability in the system. I patched it. You were the legacy code that refused to update. I replaced it. Richard stepped toward me, the leather folder creaking in his grip. "I'm here to offer you a merger, Elena. A real one. My remaining holdings in the green energy sector, the ones your Aegis protocol hasn't managed to cannibalize yet. I have a non-disclosure agreement and a transfer of deed. In exchange, I want a seat on your board. I want back in." I looked at the folder. I could see the gold-embossed Sterling crest on the leather, now tarnished and faded. "You're asking for synergy with the woman who bankrupted you?" I asked. "I'm asking for survival," Richard hissed, his face contorting with a sudden, raw desperation. "I know how the game is played. You have the tech, but I have the connections. I have the history. Together, we could achieve a level of dominance that Marcus Thorne can only dream of." I took the folder from his hands. The leather was cold, the weight of it significant. I flipped it open. I didn't look at the signatures. I looked at the routing numbers for the offshore accounts. "You didn't include the Thornton Estates Swiss residuals," I said, my voice a clinical hum. Richard froze. His pupils dilated, the gray of his eyes vanishing into a void of pure, unadulterated shock. How do you know about those?" "Those were scrubbed." "Nothing is scrubbed in my world, Richard," I said. "I noticed a ghost withdrawal in the Sterling private ledger 3 years ago. I traced it to a shell company in Panama, which led back to a trust you've been using to launder the residuals from Mia's mother's estate. You weren't just protecting Julian. You were harvesting Mia's family while she was in the ward." I closed the folder with a sharp, final snap. "You don't have any leverage, Richard. You have a confession." I walked to the edge of the helipad and held the folder over the void. "Elena, wait!" Richard cried, his hand reaching out in a frantic, trembling arc. "That's 40 years of work. That's all I have left." "The audit is complete, Richard," I said. I let go. The folder didn't fall, it was caught by a violent updraft, the pages tearing free and scattering into the purple dawn like a flock of white birds. I watched them go, the deeds, the agreements, the legacy of the Sterlings, vanishing into the gray canyons of Manhattan. Richard Sterling let out a broken, whistling sound. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands clutching the concrete, his silver hair finally coming undone in the wind. He looked down at the empty air where his empire had just disappeared. He was the ghost now. The roar of a helicopter engine suddenly drowned out the wind. A sleek, black Augusta Westland descended from the clouds, its rotors creating a violent whirlpool of air that forced Richard further onto the ground. The side door slid open. Marcus Thorne sat in the darkened interior, his face a mask of stone-cold approval. He looked at Richard on the floor, then at me. "The Sterling waterfront dead is fully cleared, Elena," Thorne shouted over the engine's roar. "The board meeting starts in 20 minutes. We're discussing the acquisition of Solstice Europe." I walked toward the helicopter, my coat billowing behind me. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at Richard Sterling one last time. He was still on his knees, a small, gray figure at the zenith of a tower that no longer bore his name. "Don't worry about the floor, Richard," I said, my voice amplified by the acoustics of the helipad. "Julian will be up later to clean it." I stepped into the helicopter. The door thudded shut, a sound of absolute, armored finality. As we lifted off, the city began to shrink below us. The skyscrapers, the streets, the millions of people living their lives in the ledgers of power, all of it became a grid of light, a circuit board that I had finally learned to program. I looked down at Vance Plaza. From this height, the pale scar where the Sterling name had been was invisible. The building was a clean, black monolith, a monument to the girl who had died in the rain and the woman who had rewritten the world. Marcus Thorne handed me a crystal glass filled with a dark, amber liquid. "No ice." "To the architect," Thorne said, raising his glass. I clinked my glass against his, the sound a sharp, crystalline ring that cut through the hum of the blades. "To the system," I replied. I took a sip of the whiskey. It was hot, a liquid fire that burned away the last lingering cold of the alley. I looked out the window as we accelerated toward the horizon, the sun finally breaking over the edge of the world, bathing Manhattan in a harsh, unforgiving gold. The audit was over. The game was won. And as I leaned back into the leather seat, my pulse a steady, unhurried 60 beats per minute, I realized that satisfaction wasn't a metric I needed. I had something better. I had the code. As the helicopter banked over the Hudson, my tablet vibrated. A new notification from the Aegis protocol, unknown signal detected in the Solstice core. Origin, Moscow. Authorization, none. I stared at the screen, a slow, predatory smile touching my lips. A new player had entered the board. And I couldn't wait to audit them.